He had 100 employees who never dared interrupt him. Then a woman in a torn gray coat said one word, his name, and the most powerful man in the building froze. 20 years ago, Marcus Bellamy gave up his entire future for her. Tonight, she was standing right in front of him. His security team froze too, unsure whether to intervene or step back. Nobody around him knew her name. Nobody in his life today, not his executives, not his closest friends, had ever heard him speak of Renee Ashford. To them, Marcus Bellamy was a man who built a company from nothing, a man whose past was a locked door nobody dared to knock on. But locked doors do not stay locked forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you are about to hear is not a story about a man hiding something shameful. It is a story about a man who gave away his own future so that someone else could have one, and never told a soul what it cost him. 20 years earlier, Marcus Bellamy was not a CEO. He was a 19-year-old boy from a block in Cleveland where hope was rationed carefully, because too much of it could break your heart. He had one way out, and everybody on that block knew it. A full scholarship to study engineering at a university 3 states away, the kind of opportunity that came once in a generation to a place like his. His mother had cried the day the letter arrived. His grandmother had pinned it to the refrigerator like scripture. Marcus had spent that whole spring walking a little taller, because for the first time in his life, the future in front of him looked wider than the past behind him. His father had worked the same factory floor for 26 years and wanted something different for his son, something that did not end with a body worn down before its time. His mother cleaned houses across town, leaving before sunrise and coming home after dark, and she had told Marcus more than once that his acceptance letter was the only thing in her life she had never had to work for, only receive. Marcus carried that weight carefully. He knew what the letter meant to the people who raised him, and he knew what it meant for the block itself, because boys like him were not supposed to make it out, and everybody watching him was quietly hoping he would prove that wrong. Renee Ashford lived 2 doors down. She was the younger sister of his best friend, 1 year behind him in school, the kind of kid who had run with their group so long that nobody remembered exactly when she stopped tagging along and started belonging. She was smart in a way that made teachers nervous, always finishing her work early and asking questions nobody had answers to. Marcus used to walk her home from the library when it got dark, not because anyone asked him to, but because he could not stand the thought of her walking those blocks alone. She used to tell him that when she grew up, she was going to leave this city too, and that maybe, someday, she would follow him wherever he ended up. There was a particular afternoon Marcus never forgot, though for years he could not have said why it stayed with him. Renee was 11, sitting on the library steps with a book on engineering she had checked out because she saw Marcus reading one just like it. She told him, with the flat certainty only a child can manage, that she was going to build something someday too, something with her name on it. Marcus laughed, not unkindly, and told her she probably would. He did not know yet that he would spend the rest of his life trying to make sure that sentence came true, even after everything else about their lives had changed beyond recognition. Nobody saw what was coming that spring. Renee's mother had fallen sick without warning, the kind of sickness that empties a family's savings in a matter of weeks. Her father had left years earlier and never came back. There was no scholarship waiting for an 18-year-old girl about to apply to the very same university, no safety net beneath her family, only a stack of unpaid bills and a little sister with nowhere to turn. Marcus watched Renee try to hold her whole family together with a weight that belonged to someone twice her age, and something in him refused to look away. He had one thing of value in the world, and it was sitting on his refrigerator, pinned up like a promise he was about to break. He remembered walking past their apartment one evening and hearing Renee through the open window, speaking to her mother in a voice trying very hard to sound calm, explaining that she had figured out a way to skip lunch at school so there would be more food at home for her little sister. Marcus stood outside that window longer than he should have, unseen, and something inside him rearranged itself permanently. He did not decide anything that night, but the decision had already started, quietly, the way a fracture starts long before anything visibly breaks. The night everything changed, Marcus sat across from Renee's mother in a kitchen lit by a single bulb, and he made a decision nobody his age should have had to make. He would give up his seat at that university. He had learned, through a family friend who worked in admissions, that the scholarship could be redirected, that in rare cases a recipient could name someone else to receive it in their place if they stepped aside before the term began. It was not designed for what he wanted to do with it, but he pushed until someone let him try. He told them Renee Ashford needed that seat more than he did, and one day she would prove it. Renee's mother refused him 3 times before she finally listened. She told him he was throwing away the one thing that could change his life, that no mother wants another mother's sacrifice paid for with her own child's future. Marcus told her the truth as plainly as he could. He said that if Renee did not have a chance to finish school, to leave this block the way she had always talked about, then whatever he built for himself afterward would never feel like it was worth what he had walked past to get there. It was not charity. It was a decision about which future he could live with carrying. His mother begged him to reconsider. His grandmother did not speak to him for a week. His best friend, Renee's own brother, called him a fool to his face and meant it as a compliment and an insult at the same time. Marcus never explained himself fully to any of them, because there was no way to explain a decision that made sense only in his own heart. He simply believed, with a certainty that scared him, that Renee Ashford was going to become someone the world needed, and that his own future was a price worth paying to make sure that happened. He never told Renee the truth. He let her believe the seed had simply opened up. The morning the paperwork was finalized, Marcus walked to the mailbox alone and sent back the acceptance letter his grandmother had pinned to the refrigerator, folding it exactly the way it had arrived, as if returning it gently might soften what it meant. He did not cry until he was 3 blocks from home, sitting on a curb where nobody from his street could see him. He allowed himself that single morning to grieve the version of his life he was giving away. By the time he stood up and walked home, he had decided he would never let anyone, especially Renee, see that grief again. It belonged to him alone. Renee left for that university the following year. The scholarship deferred just long enough for the paperwork to clear, carrying a spot she believed was luck, not sacrifice. She wrote Marcus letters that first semester, full of details about her dormitory and her professors and a campus library 12 times the size of the one they used to sit outside of. Marcus kept every letter in a shoebox under his bed, reading them on nights when the warehouse shifts ran long and his own life felt smaller than it used to. He wrote back rarely, and always briefly, because he was afraid that if he wrote too honestly, the truth of what he had given up would spill out onto the page. Marcus stayed behind in Cleveland, working nights at a warehouse, watching the life he had once imagined for himself dissolve into something smaller and harder. He never once let himself regret it, not out loud, not even in the privacy of his own thoughts. But something in him closed that year, a door he would not open again for a very long time. He told himself the ache would fade. It did not. It simply learned to stay quiet, tucked beneath the version of himself he was slowly becoming, a young man who worked twice as hard as everyone around him and never fully explained why. What Marcus did not know was that Renee's family fell apart anyway. Her mother passed before she finished her 2nd year of school, and the money that had once flowed in to cover tuition and grief in equal measure was never enough to cover both. Renee dropped out quietly, told no one why, and disappeared into a version of life nobody who knew her as a girl would have recognized. She worked when she could find work. She slept in shelters when she could not. She never once tried to find Marcus, because in her mind, he had already given her everything he owed her and more, and she could not bear for him to see what had become of the gift. The letters stopped arriving at Marcus's address without explanation, and he told himself Renee had simply grown busy with her new life, the life he had made possible. He wanted to believe that so badly that he never let himself consider the alternative. He moved twice for work over the following years, and each time he left a forwarding address behind, half hoping a letter from her would eventually catch up to him. None ever did. He carried the silence the same way he carried everything else from that period of his life, quietly, without complaint, folding it into the growing list of things he had learned not to ask about out loud. Renee, meanwhile, learned to survive in ways she never could have imagined as a girl reading library books on the front steps of her building. She worked cleaning jobs and kitchen shifts, whatever kept a roof over her head for a few more weeks at a time. There were stretches, especially in the coldest years, when there was no roof at all, only a shelter bed if she was fortunate enough to find one open. She kept a single photograph of her mother folded inside her coat pocket through all of it, and on the hardest nights, she would take it out and remind herself that surviving was its own form of keeping a promise. Marcus, meanwhile, rebuilt his life from the ground floor of a warehouse into an entire industry. He studied at night, taking classes 2 at a time at the local community college, determined to build something with his own hands even without the university education he had given away. He borrowed money he could not afford to lose, betting everything on a manufacturing idea nobody else believed in. He built a company on instincts sharpened by loss, driven by a hunger that people around him mistook for ambition, when really it was grief wearing a suit, walking into boardrooms and refusing to leave until someone finally said yes. Every promotion, every deal, every headline with his name on it carried the weight of a debt he never spoke of. He began quietly funding shelters in cities he had once passed through himself. First one, then a handful more, folding a piece of every year's profit into a foundation that never carried his own name, telling himself it was simply the right thing to do even as some part of him kept reading every intake report for a face he would have known anywhere. The trail always went cold, a name that surfaced once and never appeared in a report again. Eventually, he stopped searching out loud and simply carried her with him instead, in the decisions he made and the man he tried to become, naming his very first product line after a street that no longer existed the way it once had. There were nights, even after the company had grown into something the business press could not stop writing about, when Marcus would sit alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home, and he would take out an old photograph of the two of them as children, taken on the library steps by a neighbor with a disposable camera. He never showed it to anyone. He kept it in the same drawer as his father's old watch and his grandmother's church program from the funeral he had missed because of a business trip he could not reschedule. Success, he had learned, did not erase what it cost to build it. 11 years after Renee left Cleveland, Marcus came closer to finding her than he ever realized at the time. By then his quiet network of shelters had grown to a dozen cities, and he still read the anonymized intake reports himself most nights, long after his staff had gone home. One report from a shelter 4 hours from where Marcus was living matched closely enough that he flew out the following weekend, walking the surrounding blocks for 2 full days, showing the old library photograph to anyone who would look at it. He missed her by 6 days. The shelter director remembered a woman who fit the description perfectly, but by the time Marcus arrived, she had already moved on to another city, chasing a kitchen job that fell through before she even arrived. Marcus did not know, standing on that street corner with a photograph going soft at the edges in his coat pocket, that Renee had walked those same blocks the week before, close enough that their paths had nearly crossed without either of them knowing it. He left his business card with every shelter worker on that block, along with a phone number that would remain active for the next 9 years specifically in case anyone ever called it with her name attached. Nobody ever did. He flew home 2 days later and told no one why he had canceled a critical merger meeting, allowing his executives to believe it was nothing more than a scheduling conflict. That near miss changed something in Marcus permanently. He stopped believing distance was the obstacle keeping them apart, and started to fear something worse, that Renee might not want to be found at all, that perhaps she had built a version of peace for herself that did not include the reminder of everything she had lost. He never stopped searching entirely, but he allowed himself, for the first time, to imagine a future where the debt he carried would simply remain unpaid, carried quietly to his grave the way some promises are, not because he had given up, but because he had run out of certainty that finding her was even the kindest thing left to do. The evening Renee finally found him outside the tower bearing his name, she had already walked past that building 11 times over 3 separate weeks, standing across the street each time, watching him leave through the same revolving doors at roughly the same hour, losing her nerve before she ever crossed the street to reach him. She had recognized him instantly the first time, from a business magazine cover left behind on a bus seat months earlier, the photograph so different from the boy she remembered, and yet unmistakably him. The same set to his jaw, the same way he tilted his head slightly when he was thinking. On the 12th attempt, Renee finally crossed the street before her nerve could fail her again, and the moment she stepped toward him, his security detail moved to intercept her the way they were trained to intercept anyone who approached too quickly, too directly, closing the distance between her and Marcus before either of them could speak. For 0.3 seconds, nobody knew what was about to happen, whether she would be turned away entirely, escorted off the property the way strangers sometimes were. Her one chance at 20 years of waiting reduced to a misunderstanding on a public sidewalk that would end before it ever truly began. Marcus Bellamy looked into the eyes of the woman his security team had stopped in her tracks, and for one uncertain second, he searched her face without letting himself believe yet. It would not have been the first time someone had approached him claiming a connection to his past that was not real. More than one stranger over the years had tried exactly that, hoping a fabricated story might buy them a meeting or a check. Marcus had learned to be careful with hope. So instead of saying her name, he asked her a question only the real Renee Ashford could ever answer. Renee did not hesitate. She told him about an 11-year-old girl on a library step with a book on engineering and a promise that she would build something with her own name on it someday. And the exact words he had said back to her, laughing, not unkindly. Nobody else alive knew that afternoon had ever happened. Marcus felt 20 years of careful doubt collapse in the space of a single sentence. He raised a hand, quietly telling his team to stand down, and stepped past all of them himself to close the distance she had been too afraid to close alone. She had not come to expose him. She had not come to ask for anything at all. She had come only to say his name out loud one more time, carrying 2 decades of uncertainty about whether he would even remember the promise a 19-year-old boy once made in a kitchen with a single light bulb. Now, standing close enough to see the years written on his face too, she did not have to wonder any longer. 20 years of hardship were written across features Marcus was only now allowing himself to fully see. And beneath all of it, the particular way she still tilted her head when she was working up the courage to say something important. The tension that had gripped the sidewalk only moments earlier dissolved into something else entirely, something neither of them had words for yet. Renee spoke first, her voice steady despite everything. She told him she was not there to cause trouble, that she only wanted him to know she had never forgotten what he did, even though she had not fully understood it until years after he did it, when a former classmate finally told her the truth about how her scholarship had actually come to exist. She said she had spent a long time not knowing how to face him, ashamed of what her life had become in the years since, uncertain whether the boy who gave up everything for her would recognize the woman standing in front of him now. Marcus did not hesitate, and he did not hide her. In front of his own security team, in front of the executives who stepped out of that building moments later on their way to evening meetings, Marcus Bellamy took Renee Ashford's hands in his and told the truth for the first time in 2 decades. He told them who she was. He told them what she had cost him and what she had given him in return, though she never knew it. There was no shame in his voice, only relief, the particular relief of a man finally setting down something heavy he had carried alone for far too long. One of his executives, a young woman who had worked alongside him for nearly a decade, later said she had never seen him look more like himself than he did in that moment, standing on a public sidewalk holding the hands of a woman in a torn gray coat, unconcerned with how it looked to anyone passing by. Marcus would later say that the years he spent building a company from nothing had taught him how to be powerful, but it was Renee, standing in front of him again after 2 decades, who reminded him what it had all been for in the first place. Word of what happened outside the tower reached the company's board of directors before Marcus even made it back to his office that evening, and not everyone received it the way his junior executive had. One board member in particular, a man who had sat on that board since the company's earliest fundraising rounds, called an emergency session the following morning, arguing that a photograph of the CEO embracing a homeless woman on a public sidewalk was exactly the kind of story a rival firm could twist into a narrative about instability at the top, regardless of how touching the truth behind it actually was. He wanted a statement drafted immediately, one that framed the moment as a charitable gesture and nothing more, quietly distancing Marcus from any deeper explanation. A journalist from a financial publication had already begun asking questions by that afternoon, having recognized Marcus from a photograph a bystander posted online, and was preparing a story built entirely around speculation, hinting that a scandal from the CEO's past had finally caught up to him. The framing was already forming in the public conversation before Marcus had a chance to correct it himself, and for a few tense hours, it looked as though the very story he had spent 20 years refusing to be ashamed of was about to be rewritten by strangers into exactly the kind of scandal it had never actually been. Marcus refused to let that framing stand. He called the journalist directly, something his communications team advised against, and gave her the full truth on the record, insisting she print it exactly as he told it or not at all. He stood in front of his own board that same afternoon, the man who had argued for silence sitting directly across from him, and said plainly that he would not shrink the most important decision of his life down into a press-friendly soundbite designed to protect the stock price. If the company could not survive the truth about who he was, he told them, then it had never truly understood what kind of man it had hired in the first place. The board member who had pushed hardest for silence resigned within the month, unwilling to work for a chief executive who valued honesty over image management, and his departure made headlines of its own, though a very different kind than the one the journalist had originally set out to write. The story that eventually ran was not the scandal anyone had braced for. It was, almost word for word, the truth Marcus had told outside the tower that evening, and it did more to strengthen the trust between Marcus and the people who worked for him than any carefully managed statement ever could have. In the weeks that followed, Marcus Bellamy did not simply help Renee Ashford rebuild her life quietly and privately, the way a man protecting a secret might. He brought her into the company he had built, not as an act of charity, but as an act of long overdue partnership, because the woman he once sacrificed everything for had spent 2 decades surviving things that would have broken most people, and he recognized in her the same resilience that had built his own company from nothing. Renee did not need saving. She needed someone to finally see her, fully, without flinching. Marcus gave her that, 20 years late, but not too late. The first night Renee stayed in the guest house on his property, Marcus brought down the same shoebox he had kept on the top shelf of his closet since the day her first letter arrived, still holding every letter she had ever written him from that university dormitory, her handwriting still visible on envelopes gone soft and yellow at the edges. He had never thrown a single one away, not even in the years he told himself he had stopped waiting to hear from her. Renee had brought something of her own that night, folded inside the same coat pocket that had carried her mother's photograph for 20 years, an envelope stamped in red ink with the words "Return to sender." She had written it during her hardest winter, the one letter she allowed herself to send after swearing she never would, addressed to the only place she had for him, the warehouse where he used to work nights. It came back to her 3 weeks later, unopened, because Marcus had already moved on by then, chasing the life neither of them yet understood would eventually bring them back to this room. Renee sat on the floor of that guest house and read her own 19-year-old words back to herself until sunrise, and for the first time in 20 years, she understood exactly how closely he had been holding on the whole time, and exactly how close she had once come to being found. Renee enrolled in night classes within her first month back in his life, finishing the engineering degree she had once dreamed about on the library steps as a girl, this time on her own terms, with Marcus attending every single one of her evening lectures he could fit into his schedule, sitting quietly in the back row like a man determined not to miss a single moment he had already missed too many of. She graduated 18 months later, and Marcus stood in the audience with tears he did not bother hiding, the same tears he had once hidden from everyone 3 blocks from his childhood home. 6 months after graduation, Renee walked into Marcus's office with a proposal of her own, one he had not seen coming. She had learned by then about the quiet network of shelters he had funded for years without ever putting his name on any of it, and she wanted to build something more deliberate on top of what he had already started, a scholarship arm named for her mother that would find teenagers exactly like she once was, kids one crisis away from losing everything, and redirect opportunities to them the same way a 19-year-old boy once redirected his own. Marcus agreed before she finished explaining the second sentence. The first letter that foundation ever sent out went to a 16-year-old girl in Cleveland, on the very same block Marcus and Renee had grown up on, and Renee insisted on delivering it in person, standing on those same library steps where she had once told a teenage boy she was going to build something with her name on it. The story of Marcus Bellamy and Renee Ashford eventually became known, not as a scandal the press uncovered, but as a truth Marcus chose to tell on his own terms. In an interview he gave specifically so that Renee would never again have to explain herself to anyone who did not already understand. People did not remember him differently because he had a secret. They remembered him differently because of what the secret actually was, a sacrifice made by a boy who believed someone else's future mattered as much as his own, and a debt he spent 2 decades quietly trying to repay without ever expecting anything back, even when the world tried, briefly, to convince everyone it had been something else entirely. Renee often says now that the version of Marcus the world sees, the driven, relentless businessman, was built entirely on the foundation of a choice he made for her sake, in a kitchen, on an ordinary night, when he was still young enough to believe that kindness could cost everything and still be worth it. And Marcus, when asked whether he regretted the scholarship he gave away all those years ago, always gives the same answer. He says he did not lose a future that night. He simply chose which one he wanted to live inside of, and 20 years later, standing beside Renee Ashford, watching her hand a sealed envelope to a girl who reminded them both of who they used to be, he finally understood he had chosen correctly all along. What would you have done in Marcus's place? And do you believe a sacrifice like his ever truly gets repaid? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I will read every single one and respond personally.